There's something uniquely terrifying about watching a dream turn into a nightmare in real time. It starts with hope, ambition, and meticulous planning. It ends with a family of 4 stranded in a foreign port, their children crying from hunger, and their life savings evaporated like morning mist over the ocean. This isn't a story about bad weather or equipment failure. This is a story about how the most dangerous enemy on any sailing journey isn't the sea, it's the human capacity for self-deception. What you're about to hear will challenge everything you think you know about living the sailing dream. It's a cautionary tale that every aspiring cruiser needs to understand, because the mistakes this family made are so common, so seemingly innocent, that they could happen to anyone who dares to trade their mortgage for a main sheet. By the end of this story, you'll understand why financial planning for long-distance cruising isn't just about having enough money. It's about having enough of the right kind of money at the right time, in the right places. The Watson family, David, Sarah, and their twins Emma and Lucas, thought they had it all figured out. They had spreadsheets, they had budgets, they had 5 years of careful planning. What they didn't have was an understanding of how quickly the ocean can teach you that your carefully constructed financial reality is nothing more than wishful thinking written on paper. David Watson was the kind of man who approached everything in life like an engineering problem. At 42, he had spent nearly 2 decades as a mechanical engineer for a mining company in Calgary, methodically climbing the corporate ladder with the same precision he applied to everything else. His garage workshop was legendary among friends. Every tool in its designated place, every project completed to exact specifications. When David decided something needed to be done, it got done right, on time, and under budget. Sarah, his wife of 16 years, was his perfect complement. Where David saw systems and processes, Sarah saw possibilities and adventures. A former travel blogger who had put her career on hold when the twins were born, she had spent years living vicariously through other sailing families' Instagram feeds and YouTube channels. She could tell you the exact specifications of every popular cruising catamaran, knew the seasonal weather patterns of every major sailing route, and had mentally sailed around the world a dozen times before they ever bought their first boat. The twins, Emma and Lucas, were 12 when their parents first broached the subject of sailing around the world. Like most kids their age, they were initially horrified by the prospect of leaving their friends, their school, and their comfortable suburban life in Calgary. But Sarah and David were master salespeople when it came to their own children. They painted pictures of dolphins swimming alongside their boat, of learning about different cultures firsthand, of adventures that would make their classmates' summer vacations look mundane by comparison. The dream had been gestating for years, but it crystallized one particular evening in February 2022. David had just returned from a business trip to Vancouver, where he'd walked past the marina and seen dozens of sailboats bobbing peacefully in their slips. The contrast between the serene marina and the stress-filled boardroom he'd left earlier that day was stark. That night, he sat Sarah down at their kitchen table and said the words that would change everything. What if we actually did it? The photo that had been taped to their refrigerator for 3 years, a sleek catamaran anchored in a pristine Caribbean bay, suddenly transformed from a distant fantasy into a tangible goal. Sarah pulled out her laptop, and they spent the next 4 hours researching boats, routes, and budgets. By midnight, they had convinced themselves that not only was their dream possible, it was inevitable. The planning phase consumed their lives for the next 8 months. David approached it with the same methodical precision that had made him successful in his engineering career. He created spreadsheets that tracked every conceivable expense: boat purchase price, mandatory safety equipment, marina fees, fuel costs, food budgets, insurance premiums, emergency reserves, and maintenance funds. He researched the average cost of living in every country they planned to visit. He calculated exchange rates, inflation adjustments, and seasonal price variations. Sarah threw herself into the logistical challenges with equal enthusiasm. She researched homeschooling curricula that would work on a boat, investigated international health insurance options, and compiled lists of required vaccinations and medications for every country on their planned route. She joined dozens of sailing forums and Facebook groups, absorbing advice from families who had already made the transition from land to sea. The boat search took months. They knew they needed something large enough for a family of 4 to live aboard comfortably for several years. but small enough for David and Sarah to handle safely in challenging conditions. After viewing dozens of boats and traveling to boat shows in 3 different provinces, they found her, a 2018 Lagoon 42 catamaran named Northern Dreams, moored in Victoria, British Columbia. The boat was everything they had dreamed of and more. 42 feet of sleek fiberglass and modern engineering, with 4 private cabins, 2 full bathrooms, a spacious galley, and a salon large enough for the family to gather comfortably even in rough weather. The previous owners had already made many of the modifications necessary for long-distance cruising: upgraded electronics, additional solar panels, a water maker, and a comprehensive inventory of safety equipment. David inspected every system on the boat with the thoroughness of a professional surveyor. He tested the engines, examined the rigging, checked the electrical systems, and even crawled into the bilge to inspect the through-hull fittings. The boat was in excellent condition, meticulously maintained by owners who had clearly shared David's appreciation for proper preparation and attention to detail. The price was $485,000 Canadian, a substantial sum, but well within the budget they had established. After factoring in the sale of their Calgary home, their savings, and David's accumulated pension contributions, they would have approximately $280,000 left over for their cruising fund. According to their calculations, this would be more than enough to sustain their family for at least 3 years of comfortable cruising, with a healthy emergency reserve for unexpected expenses. The twins gradually warmed to the idea as the plan became more concrete. Emma, always the more adventurous of the two, was particularly excited about swimming with dolphins and learning to speak Spanish. Lucas, more cautious by nature, was won over by the promise of having his own private cabin and the prospect of fishing for their dinner every day. Sarah documented their preparation process in a blog called The Watson Family Adventure, which quickly gained a following among other aspiring cruising families. The house sold faster than they had anticipated. The Calgary real estate market was booming, and their well-maintained 4-bedroom home in a desirable neighborhood attracted multiple offers within a week of being listed. They accepted an offer that was $35,000 above their asking price, bringing their total liquid assets to just over $750,000 after paying off their mortgage and covering closing costs. David quit his job in March 2023, exactly 5 years after they had first begun seriously planning their sailing adventure. His colleagues threw him a farewell party that was equal parts celebration and wake. They admired his courage to pursue his dream, but couldn't imagine abandoning the security of a steady paycheck and employer-provided benefits. David's boss offered to hold his position open for 6 months, just in case he changed his mind. David politely declined, confident that there would be no looking back. The months leading up to their departure were a whirlwind of activity. They sold most of their possessions, keeping only what would fit in the boat's storage compartments and a small storage unit they rented for items they might want to reclaim if they ever returned to land-based life. Sarah's parents agreed to store the children's bicycles and a few boxes of sentimental items. Everything else, furniture, cars, appliances, books, clothes, and 15 years' worth of accumulated household goods, was sold, donated, or discarded. They took possession of Northern Dreams in May 2023, moving aboard while the boat was still moored in Victoria. The first month was an adjustment period, learning to live in a space that was roughly 1/10 the size of their former home. The twins complained about the cramped quarters and the constant motion of the boat, even while tied to the dock. Sarah struggled with the tiny galley after years of cooking in a spacious kitchen with modern appliances. David spent his days familiarizing himself with every system on the boat and making final preparations for their departure. The safety equipment inventory was impressive by any standard. They carried 2 life rafts, enough personal flotation devices for 8 people, multiple EPIRBs, a satellite communicator, comprehensive first aid supplies, and enough emergency food and water for 30 days. David had installed additional handholds throughout the boat and safety netting around the entire perimeter. The boat carried every piece of safety equipment required by both Canadian and international regulations, plus several additional items recommended by experienced cruising sailors. Their departure from Victoria on June 15, 2023 was a bittersweet moment captured in dozens of photos and videos that Sarah would later post on their blog. The marina community gathered to see them off, and several other sailing families accompanied them for the first few miles of their journey. Emma and Lucas waved goodbye from the bow as the familiar skyline of Victoria gradually faded into the distance behind them. David and Sarah stood at the helm, sharing a moment of quiet satisfaction as Northern Dreams settled into her stride in the open waters of the Strait of Juan de Fuca. Their route plan was ambitious but achievable. They would spend the summer cruising the Pacific Northwest, giving the family time to adjust to life aboard and allowing David and Sarah to gain confidence in handling the boat in various conditions. In the fall, they would head south along the California coast, eventually reaching Mexico for the winter months. The following spring, they planned to cross the Pacific to French Polynesia, beginning the true blue water portion of their adventure. The first weeks exceeded their expectations. The weather was perfect, the boat performed flawlessly, and the family quickly adapted to their new routine. The twins embraced their homeschooling curriculum, and Sarah documented their daily adventures with beautiful photos and engaging blog posts that attracted hundreds of new followers. David's engineering background proved invaluable as he fine-tuned the boat's systems and learned to optimize their performance under various sailing conditions. They spent July exploring the San Juan Islands, anchoring in pristine bays that were accessible only by boat. Emma and Lucas learned to fish, to identify marine wildlife, and to help with basic sailing tasks. Sarah's cooking skills adapted to the limitations of the boat's galley, and she took pride in preparing elaborate meals using only ingredients they could store safely without refrigeration. David's confidence as a skipper grew with each successful passage and each new anchorage they explored. August brought them to the rugged coast of Washington and Oregon. They anchored in secluded bays, surrounded by towering forests, hiked on empty beaches, and watched spectacular sunsets from their cockpit while sharing bottles of wine and planning the next day's adventure. The boat handled beautifully in the larger swells of the Pacific, and David's initial concerns about managing such a large vessel in challenging conditions proved unfounded. The budget was performing exactly as expected. Their monthly expenses were running slightly below David's projections, and they had encountered no significant unexpected costs. The boat's systems were reliable, their route planning had helped them avoid expensive marina stays, and their food costs were actually lower than they had been when living on shore. David updated their financial spreadsheets weekly, and every calculation confirmed that their money would last well beyond their minimum 3-year target. The first hint of trouble came in early September as they were preparing to leave the Pacific Northwest and begin their southbound journey along the California coast. David had been monitoring their expenses carefully, but he began to notice small discrepancies between his projections and their actual spending. Marina fees were higher than expected, fuel costs were increasing due to rising petroleum prices, and several equipment purchases had exceeded his budgeted amounts. None of these overages were dramatic individually, but they were accumulating faster than David had anticipated. He attributed the discrepancies to the learning curve associated with their first season of cruising, confident that their spending would normalize as they gained experience and refined their routines. Sarah was less concerned about the budget variances. Her blog had begun generating modest advertising revenue, and she was optimistic about the potential for additional income as their following continued to grow. She had also been contacted by several marine equipment manufacturers who were interested in having the Watson family test and review their products in exchange for free gear or small payments. These opportunities weren't generating significant income yet, but they suggested the potential for offsetting some of their expenses through their online presence. The passage south along the California coast was challenging but successful. They encountered their first significant weather, including one night of 30-knot winds and 8-foot seas that tested both the boat's capabilities and the family's resolve. David's seamanship skills proved adequate for the conditions, and the boat's performance exceeded his expectations. The twins were seasick for the first time, but they recovered quickly and began to develop their sea legs. They spent October exploring the California coast, visiting San Francisco, Monterey, and several smaller ports. The marina fees in California were substantially higher than they had budgeted for, but David rationalized the expenses necessary for the family's comfort and safety during their adjustment period. They were still learning to live aboard, and the amenities provided by full-service marinas, hot showers, laundry facilities, reliable internet, and easy access to supplies seemed worth the additional cost. November brought them to Southern California, where they joined the annual migration of cruising boats preparing to head south to Mexico. They spent several weeks in San Diego, completing final preparations for their first international passage and connecting with other cruising families who were following similar routes. The marina fees in San Diego were even higher than those they had encountered further north, but David convinced himself that these would be the last expensive marina stays for many months. The passage from San Diego to Cabo San Lucas was their first true blue water sailing experience. 3 days and 2 nights at sea, with no land visible for most of the journey. David had planned the passage carefully, choosing a weather window that promised favorable winds and reasonable seas. The crossing went smoothly, and the family's confidence in their abilities and their boat reached new heights as the mountains of Baja California appeared on the horizon. Mexico should have been where their budget began to balance. The cost of living was lower, marina fees were reasonable, and they planned to spend most of their time anchored in free anchorages rather than paying for dock space. David's projections showed their monthly expenses dropping significantly once they were established in Mexican waters. The reality was more complicated. While the basic cost of living was indeed lower in Mexico, the hidden expenses of cruising in a foreign country began to accumulate quickly. They needed Mexican boat permits, fishing licenses, and temporary import permits for various pieces of equipment. Immigration fees, port fees, and local taxes added up faster than David had anticipated. The boat's systems, which had performed flawlessly during their first season, began requiring more frequent maintenance in the tropical climate. More significantly, their spending patterns had evolved in ways that David hadn't predicted. 6 months of living aboard had taught them which conveniences were truly necessary for their happiness and which were merely nice to have. Unfortunately, most of the items in the truly necessary category were more expensive than the equivalents in the nice to have category. Fresh produce was abundant and inexpensive in Mexico, but the marine-grade equipment they needed for boat maintenance was often more expensive than similar items would have cost in Canada. Simple repairs that David could have completed easily at home required specialized marine parts that had to be shipped from the United States at considerable expense. The boat's advanced electronics and systems, while impressive and capable, proved finicky in the humid tropical environment and required frequent professional attention. Emma came down with a stomach bug in late December, shortly after Christmas. What should have been a minor illness requiring a day or 2 of rest became a week-long ordeal that required 2 visits to private medical facilities and a collection of prescription medications that weren't covered by their international health insurance. The total cost was manageable, but it represented the kind of unexpected expense that David's careful budgeting hadn't fully anticipated. Lucas broke his wrist in January while playing on a beach near Puerto Vallarta. The injury required immediate medical attention, X-rays, a cast, and several follow-up visits over the next month. Their insurance covered the majority of the medical expenses, but the logistical costs, transportation to and from medical facilities, hotel rooms near the hospital, meals eaten in restaurants instead of prepared aboard the boat, added up to nearly $2,000 before Lucas was cleared to resume normal activities. Sarah's blog had indeed begun generating modest revenue, but not at the level she had optimistically projected. The marine equipment companies that had expressed interest in working with them proved more interested in free publicity than in providing meaningful compensation. The advertising revenue from her blog was growing slowly, but remained well below the amounts needed to offset their increasing expenses. David updated his financial projections in February and experienced the first genuine moment of concern about their budget. They had been cruising for 8 months and had spent nearly $85,000 of their original $280,000 cruising fund. At their current rate of spending, their money would last approximately 18 more months, well short of their original 3-year target. He shared his concerns with Sarah, but both of them were reluctant to acknowledge the implications of the numbers. They were living their dream, the children were happy and thriving, and the idea of cutting their adventure short after less than a year felt like admitting failure. Instead, they decided to implement modest budget reductions and to explore additional income opportunities more aggressively. The budget reductions proved more difficult to implement than they had anticipated. Every expense they examined seemed either truly necessary or relatively trivial in the context of their overall spending. Marina fees were expensive, but staying anchored all the time was exhausting and limited their ability to resupply and maintain the boat. Eating in restaurants was costly, but cooking every meal aboard was time-consuming and limited their opportunities to experience local cultures. Professional maintenance was expensive, but David's mechanical skills, while substantial, weren't adequate for all of the specialized systems on their modern boat. March brought a series of equipment failures that tested both their budget and their resolve. The boat's water maker, which allowed them to produce fresh water from seawater, developed a persistent leak that required replacement of several expensive components. The refrigeration system began cycling irregularly, eventually requiring professional diagnosis and repair. Most seriously, they discovered that one of the boat's engines had developed an oil leak that would require hauling the boat for repair. The combined cost of these repairs was nearly $15,000, a substantial portion of their remaining budget. David investigated the possibility of doing some of the work himself, but the specialized tools and knowledge required for modern marine systems were beyond his capabilities. They had no choice but to pay the professional rates charged by marine technicians, which were typically double or triple the equivalent costs for similar work on land-based equipment. The engine repair required hauling the boat at a marine boatyard in La Paz, Mexico. The haul-out itself cost $800. The repair work took 3 weeks and cost $8,400, and their accommodation and meal expenses during the repair period added another $2,200 to the total bill. David watched helplessly as their carefully accumulated cruising fund evaporated in a matter of weeks. By April, their financial situation had become critical. They had spent $142,000 in 10 months of cruising, leaving them with approximately $138,000 remaining. At their current rate of spending, they had perhaps 10 more months before they would be forced to return home. The dream of cruising for 3 years and eventually circumnavigating the globe was clearly no longer achievable with their current resources. David began investigating ways to reduce their expenses more dramatically. They could sell some of their safety equipment and electronics, but the resale market for marine gear was poor, and they would recover only a fraction of what they had originally paid. They could seek employment in Mexico, but their tourist visas didn't permit work, and the bureaucratic process of obtaining work permits would be expensive and time-consuming. They could cut their cruising short and return immediately to Canada, but that would mean admitting that their carefully planned adventure had been a failure. Sarah suggested that they consider spending more time anchored in free anchorages and less time in marinas, but their experience had taught them that this approach had hidden costs of its own. Anchoring was free, but it required constant vigilance, limited their access to supplies and services, and increased their fuel consumption as they motored to shore more frequently. When they calculated the true cost of anchoring, including fuel, wear and tear on their dinghy and outboard motor, and the additional time and effort required for basic activities, the savings were less dramatic than they had hoped. The emotional toll of their financial stress began affecting the entire family. David became obsessed with tracking their expenses, updating his spreadsheets multiple times per day, and questioning every purchase, no matter how small. Sarah felt guilty about her blog's modest revenue and began working longer hours, trying to build their online following. The twins sensed their parents' anxiety and began worrying about whether they would have to go home before completing their adventure. Emma asked one evening in May whether they were poor now. The question hit David like a physical blow. They weren't poor by any reasonable definition. They still had more money in their account than most people earned in several years. But in the context of their cruising dream, they were indeed running out of resources much faster than they had ever imagined possible. The breaking point came in early June, almost exactly 1 year after their departure from Victoria. They were anchored in a beautiful bay near Mazatlan, Mexico, watching another spectacular Pacific sunset and trying to decide whether to continue south towards Central America or to begin the long journey home to Canada. David had spent the afternoon updating their financial projections using 12 months of actual expense data rather than his original estimates. The numbers were devastating. They had spent $156,000 in 12 months of cruising, more than half of their original budget. At their current rate of spending, they had less than 9 months of cruising funds remaining. If they wanted to retain enough money to buy a house when they returned to Canada, they needed to head home immediately. The conversation that evening was one of the most difficult of their marriage. Both David and Sarah had invested enormous emotional energy in their sailing dream. They had sold their house, quit their jobs, taken their children out of school, and staked their identities on the success of their adventure. Acknowledging that their financial planning had been inadequate felt like admitting that they had been naive, irresponsible parents who had risked their family's security for a selfish fantasy. But the numbers didn't lie. They had enough money for perhaps 6 more months of cruising if they were very careful, or 8 months if they were willing to compromise their safety and comfort significantly. Neither option would allow them to complete even a fraction of the journey they had originally planned. Sarah was the first to voice what they were both thinking: maybe we need to go home. The decision, once acknowledged, brought a mixture of relief and profound disappointment. They would cut their losses, return to Canada, and attempt to rebuild their land-based life with whatever remained of their financial resources. They would keep the boat. It was too expensive to sell in Mexico and ship back to Canada, and perhaps use it for shorter cruises in Canadian waters. The journey home took 2 months. They retraced their route north along the Mexican coast, up the California seaboard, and back to Victoria, British Columbia. The familiar anchorages and harbors that had seemed so exciting during their southbound journey now felt like waypoints, marking their retreat from adventure back to conventional responsibility. The twins handled the transition better than their parents had expected. While they were disappointed that their adventure was ending early, they were also genuinely homesick for their friends, their grandparents, and the familiar routines of land-based life. Emma admitted that she had missed having her own bedroom and bathroom. Lucas confessed that he was looking forward to playing hockey again. Sarah's final blog post about their cruising adventure was honest about their financial miscalculations and the lessons they had learned. The post went viral within the sailing community, generating hundreds of comments from other cruising families who shared similar experiences. Many readers thanked Sarah for her honesty and admitted that they had also struggled with budget overruns during their own sailing adventures. David found work as a consulting engineer within 3 months of their return to Victoria. His skills were still in demand, and his employer was understanding about his year-long sabbatical. The salary was less than what he had earned in Calgary, but it was sufficient to support their family while they rebuilt their savings and decided what to do with Northern Dreams. They rented a house in Victoria rather than buying immediately, using the time to reassess their priorities and financial goals. The house felt enormous after a year of living aboard their boat, and the twins initially complained about having too much space and too little adventure in their daily routines. The boat remained their most valuable asset, but also their most expensive liability. Marina fees, insurance, and maintenance costs consumed nearly $3,000 per month, even when they weren't actively cruising. David investigated selling Northern Dreams, but discovered that the market for large cruising catamarans in Canada was limited. Most serious buyers were located in warmer climates where boats could be used year-round. Eventually, they found a solution that satisfied both their financial needs and their emotional attachment to their sailing dream. They entered into a partnership with a charter company that would use Northern Dreams for week-long sailing vacations in the Caribbean. The arrangement provided enough income to cover the boat's expenses and generated modest profit that helped rebuild their depleted savings account. 3 years after their return to land, David and Sarah could analyze their sailing adventure with the clarity that only comes with time and distance. They had achieved something that most people only dream about. They had sailed their own boat to foreign countries, homeschooled their children while crossing oceans, and created memories that would last for the rest of their lives. But they had also learned harsh lessons about the difference between careful planning and realistic planning. David's budgets had been based on optimistic assumptions about their spending discipline, their mechanical abilities, and their willingness to accept discomfort in order to save money. He had underestimated the cumulative effect of small convenience purchases and the true cost of maintaining a complex boat in a harsh marine environment. More fundamentally, They had learned that the sailing dream sold by magazines, YouTube channels and boat shows often bears little resemblance to the financial reality of long-distance cruising. The families who successfully cruise for years on modest budgets typically have different priorities, different tolerances for discomfort, and different definitions of necessary expenses than middle-class families accustomed to suburban conveniences. Sarah's analysis was more philosophical. She believed their adventure had been successful, despite ending earlier than planned, because it had taught their family that happiness and security came from relationships and experiences rather than from material possessions and conventional definitions of success. The year they spent sailing had brought them closer together as a family and had given them perspectives on life that would influence their decisions for years to come. Emma and Lucas, now teenagers, looked back on their sailing year as the defining adventure of their childhood. They had learned to be comfortable with uncertainty, to adapt to changing circumstances, and to find joy in simple pleasures like a calm anchorage or a successful fishing expedition. Emma had decided to study marine biology in college, partly inspired by the year she spent observing ocean life from the deck of Northern Dreams. Lucas had become an accomplished sailor and talked about buying his own boat someday, though he planned to budget more carefully than his parents had. The Watson family's story illustrates the most common pitfall facing families who attempt to live their sailing dreams: the gap between projected expenses and actual costs. David's budgets were careful and comprehensive, but they were based on theoretical scenarios rather than practical experience. He had accounted for major expenses like boat maintenance, marina fees, and insurance, but he had underestimated the countless small expenses that accumulate during extended cruising. More importantly, he had failed to account for the fact that their standards and expectations would evolve during their journey. The family that left Victoria in 2023 was willing to accept significant inconvenience and discomfort in order to make their dream affordable. The family that was cruising in Mexico 12 months later had learned which conveniences were truly necessary for their happiness and safety, and those conveniences were expensive. The hidden costs of cruising extend far beyond boat maintenance and fuel. International phone and internet service, medical care in foreign countries, transportation costs when the boat is hauled for repairs, equipment replacement due to the harsh marine environment, and the premium prices charged for everything at remote sailing destinations all contribute to budget overruns that even careful planners struggle to predict. Professional cruising consultants now recommend that families budget at least 50% more than their initial projections, and that they prepare for the possibility that their actual expenses may be double their optimistic estimates. The families who cruise successfully for years typically fall into one of three categories: those with substantially more money than they think they need, those willing to accept a much more austere lifestyle than most middle-class families consider acceptable, or those who generate significant income while cruising through remote work, chartering their boat, or other maritime businesses. The Watson family's financial miscalculation wasn't the result of reckless spending or poor planning. It was the predictable result of underestimating the true cost of maintaining their desired standard of living while sailing in foreign waters with 4 family members aboard a complex modern boat. Their experience serves as a cautionary tale for other families who may be planning similar adventures with similar financial assumptions. The dream of sailing around the world remains as compelling today as it was when the Watson family first taped that photograph to their refrigerator. But the families who achieve that dream successfully are those who understand that financial planning for extended cruising requires not just careful budgeting, but realistic assumptions about the costs of living their dream at sea. The ocean doesn't care about your spreadsheets, your projections, or your carefully constructed financial models. It only cares whether you have enough money to handle whatever challenges it decides to send your way. For the Watson family, the lesson learned was expensive but valuable. Dreams are worth pursuing, but only when they're supported by realistic planning and adequate financial resources. Their sailing adventure may have been shorter than planned, but it was real, meaningful, and ultimately successful in ways that transcended their original financial projections. Sometimes, the most important lessons are the ones that cost the most to learn.